Imagine a city, right, but I want you to entirely strip away the marble.
Yeah, you have to completely erase the Colosseum from your mind.
Exactly, delete the sprawling stone aqueducts and, wipe those grand statues away. If you zoom in on the Italian peninsula in the year 750 BC, the settlement we're looking at is, well, it's not an empire.
No, not even close to kingdom.
Right. It's a scrappy, deeply vulnerable, almost chaotic settlement built out of mud, thatch, and wooden palisades. It's basically a startup of a city.
A very aggressive startup.
Very aggressive. Because this fledgling startup has just committed a massive, scandalous provocation. I mean, they have seized the women of their neighboring tribes, most notably the Sabines.
In a desperate bid to secure a next generation.
Yeah.
Yeah, since their population was almost entirely male.
Right. And today, we are not looking at the kidnapping itself. We're looking at the explosive, world-altering fallout of that single act.
We really are. And we've compiled a very specific stack of sources for you today to dig into this. We are pulling from the foundational historical accounts. So that's the writings of Livy, the biographies of Plutarch, specifically his life of Romulus and Dionysius of Halicarnassus.
And we're also integrating some modern archaeological context, right?
Exactly, regarding the Iron Age realities of Laudium. Because our mission for this deep dive is to really analyze the key themes of this foundational conflict, the Sabine War, which stretches from about 750 to 746 BC.
So we're looking at how Rome survived its very first true existential threat.
Yeah, and we'll dissect the surprisingly small scale of early warfare, the sheer logistical nightmares of an ancient siege, and ultimately how the very women caught in the middle of this violence engineered a peace that, forged a superpower.
And we tailored this specific stack of sources for you because, well, you want to understand the actual mechanisms of history. Early Rome feels less like this grand political drama and more like, I don't know, a volatile neighborhood where a single stolen lawnmower threatens to burn down the entire block.
That is a very accurate analogy.
We are talking about incredibly high stakes here. Literal life or death, but on a geographic scale that is almost comically small.
Right.
So, to set the stage for you, Rome has just seized these women. The natural assumption is that the neighboring tribes would just, immediately march on Rome and burn it to the ground in retaliation.
You would think so. But the primary texts indicate a really surprising delay.
Yeah, the Sabines seem to be bogged down in endless diplomatic bureaucracy.
They do. The textual evidence points to a period of really intense, prolonged deliberation. I mean, the Sabines are acting with the caution of a much larger, more established power facing a complex diplomatic crisis.
Because in the archaic world, diplomacy wasn't just sending a quick envoy, right?
Oh, no. It involved deeply entrenched religious and legal rituals. Declaring war required the involvement of priests, the seeking of auguries to ensure the gods actually favored the conflict.
Like checking bird flights and animal entrails.
Exactly. And there were formal, ritualistic demands for restitution that had to be made right at the borders of the offending territory. So the Sabines were methodically going through all these ancient protocols. They're gathering alliances, sending embassies, and really calculating their logistical requirements.
Which obviously takes time. And while the Sabines are treating this like some slow-moving geopolitical chess match, not everyone in the immediate vicinity shares that kind of patience.
No, they don't. And our sources introduce a figure here who fundamentally alters the timeline. A neighboring sovereign named Acron.
And he's the ruler of a town called Caenina.
Right. And here, the geography is just essential for understanding the sheer proximity of this threat. Caenina was located merely 4 or 5 miles away from Romulus's settlement on the Palatine Hill.
Wait, 4 or 5 miles. That is exactly what I mean by the comically small scale. You could walk from Rome to the capital of a rival nation in, an hour and a half.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of your bitterest enemy living literally 2 subdivisions over.
That's wild. So what is Acron's motivation for jumping the gun? I mean, why not just wait for the massive Sabine coalition to form and guarantee a win?
Well, the sources characterize Acron as a bold, energetic man. He's a war-worn veteran who had already acquired a lot of fame through previous exploits. But more importantly, Plutarch notes that he had been watching this new Roman colony with an, quote, evil eye.
An evil eye. He sees what's happening.
Exactly. Acron possesses a really profound strategic awareness. He recognizes that Rome, by aggressively acquiring a female population, is solving its only major demographic weakness.
Right. They had men, but no way to make more Romans.
Precisely. He understands that if this scrappy colony is allowed to actually take root and produce a second generation, It'll eventually become just an unstoppable threat to Caenina and all the other localized states in the region.
So the abduction of the women basically provided him with the perfect, universally accepted pretext to launch a preemptive strike.
Yeah, he sees the window closing. He urges the Sabines to declare war immediately and promises to back them up. But as we establish, the Sabines are dragging their feet.
So Akron's patience just snaps.
It does. He decides to bypass the coalition completely. He gathers his own forces, which the texts describe as a rather rude and half-organized army, and he just marches directly on Rome alone.
Which is a profound risk. I mean, he crosses those few miles of territory, and the two forces meet on an open plain just outside the Roman settlement. But instead of an immediate chaotic clash of these two militias, the leaders make a highly ritualized decision.
They do. Romulus and Akron agree to settle the entire conflict through single combat.
Let's analyze the mechanics of that for a second. They tell their armies to stand down, and the soldiers literally form a human ring around the two commanders.
Yeah, it creates this intense gladiatorial arena right there in the mud.
And the texts emphasize a stark physical contrast between the two men, which I find fascinating. Romulus is tall, he's athletic, but the sources specifically note his face still has the softness and delicacy of youth.
He is essentially a very athletic teenager or young man in his early 20s.
Right. And Akron, conversely, is hardy, stern, and just the absolute embodiment of a seasoned veteran.
The martial spectators forming that ring genuinely anticipated a very unequal contest. I mean, Akron had the experience. He had the physical hardening of years of combat and the psychological edge of being a proven killer.
So I have to ask about the strategic logic here. If I am Akron, right, an aggressive veteran leader trying to squash a vulnerable startup city, why on earth would I risk my own life and my entire campaign in a one-on-one duel against a younger, taller, clearly athletic opponent?
It's a huge gamble.
Right. Even if Romulus looks young, a sword thrust from a 20-year-old kills you just as dead as one from a veteran. Was this purely just his ego?
Well, it's a mixture of ancient honor culture and really practical battlefield psychology. In archaic Italy, a leader's political authority rested almost entirely on his personal physical prowess.
Yeah.
He was the alpha of his group.
So he had to prove it constantly.
Exactly. If a younger, untested leader challenged him in front of both armies, declining that duel would have been perceived as devastating cowardice. It could have caused his own men to just lose faith and break formation entirely.
Ah, so he was trapped by the challenge.
Furthermore, Akron likely believed his veteran instincts, knowing how to parry, how to manage stamina, how to exploit a novice's overextension, would easily overcome just raw youth. He needed to physically demonstrate that his evil eye was backed by martial supremacy.
So they step into the ring, and right before the clash, Romulus makes a highly specific vow to Jupiter, the chief deity. He promises that if he survives and wins, he will ascribe all the glory to the god, and he will literally dedicate Akron's armor as a sacred trophy in Rome.
Yes, the spolia opima.
And the ensuing fight is swift. Romulus doesn't just win, he strikes Akron down and kills him on the spot.
The psychological impact of that moment on the Caeninense army just cannot be overstated. When an archaic military force witnesses their invincible leader, like the very core of their command structure, slain in single combat.
Cohesion just evaporates. And Romulus is kneeling in the dirt, physically stripping the bronze armor off Akron's fallen body right there in the middle of the human ring. The Caeninense soldiers watch their king being looted, they panic completely, and break into a chaotic rout.
They flee back toward their city of Caenina, and Romulus's forces pursue them. Because the Caeninenses are completely demoralized and disorganized, their city falls almost immediately.
Which brings us to a really pivotal juncture in historical statecraft. Because what Romulus does in the immediate aftermath of this victory actually begins the fundamental transformation of the Roman state organization.
It's a huge turning point. The standard playbook for ancient warfare, especially after a preemptive strike by an enemy, was incredibly brutal. You raze the city, slaughter the men, and enslave the surviving women and children to enrich your own populace.
Right, that was just Tuesday in the Iron Age. But Romulus flips the script entirely. He gathers the terrified inhabitants of Caenina, who were undoubtedly waiting for the executions to begin. But instead of the sword, he offers them a paradigm shift.
He declares he holds no resentful feelings toward them. He tells them that if they abandon Caenina and relocate to Rome, they won't be slaves.
Which is mind-blowing for the time.
It is. They will be incorporated into the Roman state as brothers and admitted to all the privileges of citizens.
That is the genius of early Roman assimilation. But before we delve into the geopolitical ramifications of that citizenship offer, we have to examine the cultural mechanism Romulus uses to legitimize his victory and fulfill that vow to Jupiter.
Because this is the birth of the Roman triumph.
Exactly. And the sources describe this procession with such vivid detail. Romulus's soldiers cut down a small oak tree, they trim the branches, and Romulus literally hangs the stripped weapons and armor of Acron upon this wooden trunk.
It's basically a giant morbid scarecrow.
Yeah, and he marches this trophy back into Rome. He's walking in the middle of the procession, his long hair flowing over his shoulders, wearing a crown woven from laurel leaves. And the Roman citizens, the men, the recently abducted women, the children, they're all crowding the rooftops and the gates, cheering wildly.
And this rustic, muddy parade is the original model, the absolute foundation for the magnificent triumphal spectacles that would come to define the Roman Empire centuries later.
Right.
When you picture Julius Caesar or Trajan parading through marble streets with elephants, gold, and thousands of captives, it all traces back to this singular, localized event. A young warlord walking through the mud with an enemy's armor hanging on a piece of wood. It is the genesis of Rome's imperial pageantry.
And he carries this oak tree trophy to one of the hills in the city, an area sacred to Jupiter, and he builds a temple to house it. This is the temple of Jupiter Feretrius. But the architectural reality of this temple is fascinating.
It really grounds the whole story.
Our sources explicitly state the dimensions of this structure built to house these incredibly significant spoils. It was 5 feet wide and 10 feet long.
The physical scale is just so incredibly humbling.
A 5 by 10-foot structure is essentially the size of a modern walk-in closet. You could barely fit 2 people inside it.
Yeah, barely.
When we hear the word temple in a Roman context, we are conditioned to imagine massive columns and sweeping steps. But this detail strips away all that later mythology. It shows us the stark, humble reality of an archaic settlement. It was barely more than a wooden shrine.
Yet its symbolic weight was immense. The physical temple was tiny, sure, but the political philosophy born on that campaign was massive. Romulus realized that executing the Caeninenses would only breed generational resentment, right? It would leave Rome surrounded by depopulated wasteland.
So by offering them citizenship, he transformed a hostile threat into a massive influx of human capital.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a one-time anomaly. The sources tell us that shortly after Caenina falls, 2 other neighboring cities, Crustumerium and Antemna, begin launching hostile incursions into Roman territory.
Right, these were also cities where some of the seized women had originally lived, so they apparently realize a frontal assault is too risky now, so they try guerrilla tactics, sending small bands of armed men to pillage Roman farmlands.
And Romulus responds with overwhelming speed. He organizes his troops, marches out, and appears before their walls, completely without warning. He captures both Crustumerium and Antemnae before their inhabitants can even organize a coherent defense.
And once again, the aftermath is where the true statecraft occurs. He brings all the Roman women who had formerly belonged to these 2 conquered cities before him and the Roman Senate.
The texts describe these women entering the Senate house in a state of absolute terror. I mean, they are hiding their faces, weeping, utterly convinced that Romulus is going to inflict some horrific collective punishment on them in retribution for their countrymen's guerrilla attacks.
Because that's what usually happened.
Exactly. But Romulus uses this moment for a masterclass in psychological and political maneuvering. He calms them and explains the reality of the situation. Their countrymen chose war over the friendship Rome offered. They lost, and their lives are completely forfeit by the laws of archaic war.
But, Romulus tells them, we spare and forgive them for your sakes. He explicitly states that through the women, their fathers and brothers will receive life, liberty, and happiness.
It is a brilliant move. He pardons the enemy combatants specifically to honor the women.
Which does 2 things simultaneously, right? First, it incredibly reinforces the women's loyalty and gratitude toward Rome. Second, it completely neutralizes the hostile threat of the neighboring towns.
Yeah, he extends the exact same offer he gave to Caenina. The defeated men can move to Rome, reunite with their female relatives, and live as full citizens. He even goes a step further, promising not to destroy their original cities, but to send Roman citizens out to colonize them, fully integrating their territories into the Roman Commonwealth.
This generosity and victory really became the blueprint for Rome's entire subsequent foreign policy. I mean, compare this to other ancient powers like Sparta.
Right, Sparta stubbornly refused to extend citizenship to conquered peoples. That created a massive, resentful underclass of helots that constantly threatened the state from within. Rome's strategy of assimilation caused its population and military capacity to just explode.
It was essentially a strategy of hoarding human capital. And this sudden influx of thousands of new citizens from Caenina, Crustumerium, and Antemna created an immediate physical problem for Rome. The city literally burst, it seems.
The physical expansion of this city was a direct consequence of this policy. The sources note a really remarkable event here. A prominent Etruscan general named Caelius, who lived north of the Tiber River, was observing all of this.
He's watching the startup acquire all its competitors.
Right. And he was so impressed by this public sentiment of generosity and the rapid growth of the city that he brought his entire army in following over to join the colony voluntarily.
A completely bloodless acquisition of a foreign army, purely based on Rome's reputation for assimilation. That's incredible.
Precisely. And to accommodate Caelius and the massive accession of the conquered populations, Rome had to physically expand its borders. A new hill, previously outside the settlement, was enclosed and brought within the Pomerium.
The Pomerium, that's the sacred religious boundary of the city, right?
Yes. And it was named the Capitoline Hill,
Yeah.
after that very Etruscan general. The defensive walls were extended all the way down to the bank of the Tiber River to present a continuous line of defense.
Which perfectly illustrates how empires actually grow. You don't build a superpower just by destroying everything in your path. You build it by absorbing your rivals. You take their strength, their geography, their people, and you make it your own.
Exactly.
However, while Rome is busy absorbing these small towns and, celebrating localized triumphs and building new walls, the primary existential threat has not vanished.
No, the Sabines are still out there. The coalition that was patiently, methodically working through its diplomatic bureaucracy.
Right. While Romulus was putting down these localized border skirmishes, the Sabines were utilizing that time to prepare for total, unrestrained war. The era of a small-time warlord like Acron marching over with a half-baked local militia is over.
The primary sources make it clear that the Sabines were not conciliated by Romulus's generosity to others. In fact, observing Rome's rapid assimilation of Caenina and Antemna and witnessing its exploding population only exacerbated their fear and ill will.
They realize Rome is no longer just a nuisance.
It's a rapidly metastasizing power. They realized they needed to strike a massive, final, effectual blow.
So they spent their time meticulously. They enlisted troops from across their territories, collected massive stores of provisions, hoarded munitions of war, and formed alliances with states further out to draw them into the coalition.
And when they finally assemble their forces on the frontier, it is a mighty host, vastly outnumbering the Roman defenders. They place this massive army under the command of a general named Titus Tutius.
Rome, meanwhile, is acutely aware of this gathering storm. Romulus knows a siege is imminent. He procures great stores of provisions, strengthens the palisades, builds new ramparts and towers. He also receives some vital logistical support from his grandfather, Numitor.
Right, the king of Alba Longa. He secretly sends supplies of weapons and actual military engines designed for defending besieged cities.
So both sides are digging in for a protracted, brutal conflict. Which brings us to a fascinating logistical reality of the 8th century BC, which our sources highlight. We tend to imagine the countryside around ancient Rome as like endless, neat rows of wheat and olive groves.
Yeah, that's the later stereotype. But the text explicitly notes that in those ancient days, pasturage, the rearing of flocks and herds, was a far more advantageous and common way to procure food than tilling the soil.
Because the agricultural economy of archaic Latium was heavily pastoral. Tilling that heavy volcanic soil required iron tools and massive labor pools that simply didn't exist yet in large numbers.
Exactly. Therefore, the rural population of the Roman territory consisted almost entirely of herdsmen managing vast flocks of sheep and herds of cattle across the open plains.
So when Romulus gets word that the immense Sabine army has crossed the frontier, he issues a drastic, terrifying order. He commands all the herdsmen to abandon the countryside and seek shelter inside the city walls.
But they don't just walk in alone.
No. Romulus requires that all the flocks of sheep and herds of cattle be driven into the city with them to be shut up in enclosures at the rear of the settlement.
Consider the logistical and sociological strain of that order. The city is already crowding with the newly assimilated citizens from the conquered towns, And now, thousands of massive, frightened animals are being driven through the narrow, muddy streets and crammed into makeshift pens behind the wooden walls.
I really want you to visualize and, unfortunately, smell this scenario. They essentially turned the entire back half of the city of Rome into a massive, panic-driven barnyard.
It must have been deafening.
You have the constant noise of thousands of bleeding sheep and lowing cattle. You have the immediate crisis of sanitation, the stench of animal waste accumulating in a confined urban space.
Plus, you have to secure massive amounts of fresh water and fodder just to keep the animals alive so they can be used as emergency rations.
The psychological stress on the civilian population inside those walls must have been excruciating.
The internal strain was immense, absolutely. But we also have to analyze the strategic impact this scorched earth policy had on the invading Sabines.
Right. What happens when the Sabine army arrives? They cross the frontier with thousands of troops, expecting to forage, to raid farms, to capture local food supplies to sustain their march. Instead, what do they find?
Complete desolation. The sources state the Sabine army found the Roman territory entirely deserted and solitary. There was not a single herdsman, not a single animal, not a single grain store left to plunder.
They advanced across this ghost landscape almost to the very gates of Rome.
And to move a large, ancient army requires constant, massive foraging. Finding a completely stripped countryside means your force is instantly deprived of local sustenance.
It forces the Sabines to rely entirely on their own stretched supply lines from day one.
Exactly. It removes any opportunity for easy victories or plunder, forcing them into a direct, immediate confrontation with the heavily fortified city.
So the Sabines march right up to the walls and set up their encampment. The sources mention they camp on the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars. This is a spacious, level plain on the western side of the Capitoline Hill, right outside the city defenses.
However, as any military historian understands, ancient sieges were brutally slow, agonizing affairs. The Sabines, despite their overwhelming numbers, possessed no sophisticated siege engines capable of breaching the fortified walls of the Palatine or the citadel on the Capitoline.
They could not assault the walls with any prospect of success without suffering just catastrophic casualties.
So it becomes a waiting game.
A staring contest where one side is starving outside the walls and the other side is enduring the disease and squalor of thousands of animals inside the walls. And when military tactics grind to a halt in a siege, people start looking for alternative, often darker solutions.
Yeah, the prolonged stalemate creates the conditions for one of the most infamous incidents of early Roman history, the treason at Topea.
To understand this event, we have to look at the topography. The Capitoline Hill was a steep, rocky outcropping that served as the citadel. It was a crucial, elevated stronghold commanding the approaches to the main city.
And it was commanded by a trusted Roman noble named Tarpeius. His daughter, Tarpeia, becomes the fulcrum of a shocking act of betrayal.
According to the texts, one day Tarpeia goes down to a solitary, secluded gate of the citadel. She is perhaps fetching water from a spring outside the walls, and she enters into a parley with some Sabine soldiers who are scouting the defenses.
Now, the historical accounts fracture significantly regarding Tarpeia's motivations here, and it is vital we analyze both perspectives presented by our sources. They reflect different ways the Romans later tried to process this trauma.
Right, because there's the standard version and then the counter theory.
Exactly. The most commonly received account, favored by historians like Livy, paints Tarpeia as motivated by sheer, overwhelming greed.
In this version, she looks over the walls, sees the Sabine commanders, and is completely captivated by the heavy gold bracelets and rings they wear on their left arms, because the Sabines were known for their wealth and ornamentation.
So she makes a treacherous deal. She tells the Sabine soldiers she will secretly open the postern gate at night and let their army into the impregnable citadel. Her price. She demands what they wear upon their left arms.
Meaning the gold.
Right. The Sabines eagerly agree to this price. However, a secondary account, asserted by writers like Piso and debated by Plutarch, offers a completely different psychological motivation.
This account suggests Tarpeia's apparent treachery was actually a highly dangerous, deep-laid strategy of deception.
A patriotic double-cross.
Exactly. This version claims Tarpeia never intended to hand over the citadel. The theory is that she intended to lure a detachment of Sabines into a fatal bottleneck.
She allegedly sent secret word to Romulus about the agreement, hoping he would dispatch a strong, hidden force of Roman soldiers to intercept and slaughter the Sabines the moment they squeezed through the narrow gate.
But if she was setting a trap, why wouldn't Romulus coordinate with her? Leaving her alone to manage an invading army at a gate seems like incredibly poor military communication.
Well, that logical gap is precisely why the greed narrative became the dominant historical memory. If it was a coordinated trap, the Roman communication completely failed. But regardless of whether her intention was treasonous greed or a botched military snare, the sources agree that the physical result was catastrophic.
It fails completely. The Sabines arrive at the gate at midnight, not as a small detachment, but in overwhelming force. They surge through the postern gate, bearing down all opposition. They capture the citadel.
And then they turned to Tarpeia to fulfill their end of the bargain.
They promised to give her what they wore upon their left arms.
But the Sabines did not just wear gold on their left arms. They wore their heavy bucklers, their massive wooden leather shields on their left arms as well.
As the soldiers march past her into the conquered citadel, they do not hand her bracelets. They hurl their massive shields onto her.
One by one, they throw these heavy bucklers onto Tarpeia until she is literally crushed to death under the sheer weight of them.
It is a brutal, savage irony. They fulfill the exact wording of the contract while executing her for her treachery.
The psychological resonance of this act echoed throughout Roman history. A steep, precipitous cliff on the southern side of the Capitoline Hill was named the Tarpeian Rock in her memory.
And for centuries afterward, during the height of the Republic and the Empire, the Tarpeian Rock was the site where individuals convicted of treason against the state were hurled to their deaths. Her name became synonymous with the ultimate betrayal.
With the citadel lost, Romulus is in a desperate tactical position. He still holds the main settlement on the Palatine Hill, but the Sabines now occupy the high ground of the Capitoline.
They have a commanding vantage point over the Romans. Romulus realizes he can no longer just hide behind the palisades and play defense. The danger is too imminent. The Sabines could launch downward assaults at any time.
He is forced to take his army out of the fortified city onto the plain, that low, marshy valley lying between the Palatine and Capitoline Hills, and fight the massive Sabine army head-on.
And what follows is not a single, clean, decisive battle. The topography of that valley, which would centuries later become the paved expanse of the Roman Forum, was rugged and uneven.
The sources describe a series of chaotic, desperate, partial contests extending over several days. The fighting was incredibly ferocious because there was absolutely no room for retreat.
It was a claustrophobic meat grinder, and the visual setting is deeply unsettling. The walls of the Roman city on one side and the captured citadel on the other were lined with spectators.
The civilian men, the children, and the Sabine women themselves were looking down on the valley as if it were a vast, bloody amphitheater.
You have families standing on the walls, watching their husbands and brothers fighting for their lives in the mud just a few hundred yards below.
The endurance required from both sides was staggering. They would fight all day until exhaustion set in, leaving the valley floor covered in the dead and dying.
Neither side could gain a definitive tactical advantage. The texts note that the carnage was so profound they actually had to agree to a temporary truce, a day off by mutual consent, simply to clear the valley of the corpses.
Removing the horrid relics of the previous combats, as the source grimly phrases it, just to prevent the outbreak of disease. And when the truce expired, they returned to the slaughter with escalated ferocity.
The historical accounts zoom in on two incredibly vivid, specific incidents during these valley battles that anchor the chaos and show how unpredictable ancient combat actually was. The first involves the Roman leader, Romulus himself.
Right. Romulus, leading from the front, spots a localized advantage. A party of Sabines breaks formation, and Romulus recklessly pursues them right up the slope toward the captured citadel.
Hoping to ride their confusion through the gates and retake the high ground.
Exactly. But the Sabines, stationed up on the citadel walls, see the Roman leader charging up the hill. They can't reach him with swords, so they start hurling massive stones down the slope.
And one of these heavy stones strikes Romulus squarely in the head. The impact is devastating. He goes down instantly, stunned and completely senseless.
We must consider the reality of traumatic brain injuries in archaic warfare. A stone to the head without the protection of a heavy, enclosed helmet could easily be fatal.
When the Roman soldiers see their seemingly invincible founder, the man who slew Acron in single combat, fall unconscious to the dirt. Panic ripples through the lines.
The momentum instantly shatters. His terrified men abandon the assault, pick up his limp body, and carry him off the battlefield back behind the city walls.
It's a massive psychological blow to the Romans. He does eventually regain consciousness and returns to the fight, but it shows how fragile leadership was. One random rock could have ended the Roman civilization in 750 BC.
It really could have. And the second incident, the source's detail, is equally wild, and it involves a Sabine general named Curtius.
This incident provides a fascinating geological and topographical insight into the early Roman landscape. Curtius and Romulus, prior to the head injury, engage in a desperate hand-to-hand combat.
Other soldiers surge around them, the duel devolves into a massive swirling brawl, and Curtius, bleeding and surrounded by Romans, is forced to flee blindly for his life across the valley floor.
He's sprinting in a panic, trying to escape the Roman swords, and he blunders straight into a massive geological hazard. The text describes it as a swampy pool, a deep depression filled with water left behind by the seasonal inundations of the Tiber River.
It was an old, deserted channel, and the surface was entirely covered in thick, mossy, floating vegetation. It looked like solid ground, but it was a treacherous bog.
Curtius runs headlong into the vegetation, breaks through the surface, and plunges deep into the muck and water. He is weighed down by his bronze armor and weapons.
Romulus, pursuing him, sees the Sabine general vanish into the swamp. Assuming the man is doomed to drown in the mud, Romulus turns his attention away to find another target.
But Curtius doesn't die. Against all odds, weighed down by armor, he manages to thrash and crawl his way out of this suffocating mossy sinkhole covered in slime and escapes back to the Sabine lines.
And what is truly remarkable about this incredibly specific, chaotic moment is the geographic legacy it left behind. The source notes that in commemoration of this near-death experience, this random swampy hole was officially named Lake Curtius.
Which demonstrates the profound persistence of memory in urban environments. The primary texts note that the name Lake Curtius was retained for centuries.
Hundreds of years later, during the height of the Roman Empire, long after the marsh had been completely drained, filled in with earth, and paved over with the gleaming marble stones of the Roman Forum, a specific section of that dry plaza was still officially known as Lake Curtius.
You could have Roman senators in flowing togas walking across dry pavement to debate in the Senate in 50 BC, and they were walking over a spot still named after a Sabine general who almost drowned in a mud puddle there 7 centuries earlier.
That layering of history is just incredible.
It is. But while these individual stories of valor, head injuries, and swamp escapes are deeply compelling, they mask a very bleak macro reality. The combats dragged on for days. The casualties were mounting.
And this brings us to the profound sociological and emotional core of the entire conflict. While the men are locked in a brutal, exhausting cycle of violence in the muddy valley, the Sabine women, the very individuals whose abduction ignited this entire geopolitical catastrophe, are enduring unimaginable psychological torment.
They are standing on the walls, watching the carnage below. The text states they were overwhelmed with anguish at the thought that day after day, those who were equally dear to them were engaged in fighting and destroying one another.
Let's analyze the psychological trap these women are in. They still deeply love their fathers, brothers, and cousins in the Sabine army outside the walls.
But over the months or years since the initial abduction, their reality has fundamentally changed. They have been integrated into Roman society. They have come to care for their Roman husbands. Crucially, they are now mothers to Roman infants.
The military situation in the valley below them is a complete, hopeless dead end. Neither army can achieve a decisive tactical victory.
The Sabines cannot breach the Roman walls. The Romans cannot dislodge the massive Sabine host from the citadel.
But more deeply, neither side can yield politically because both are trapped by the rigid, archaic codes of masculine honor.
Let's look at the Sabine perspective. They have spent years methodically preparing for this war. They marched a massive coalition army across the frontier. They have lost countless men in the valley.
They cannot possibly call a retreat and march back home without the women they came to rescue. To do so would be an admission of utter defeat and a devastating humiliation that would destroy their political standing in Italy.
Conversely, the Romans are bound by an identical honor trap. These women are no longer merely captives or spoils of war. Through the complex sociological process of archaic marriage, they have been legally and culturally integrated.
They are managing Roman households. They are the mothers of the next generation of Roman citizens.
For the Roman men to hand their own wives and the mothers of their children over to an invading army under threats of violence would bring, as the primary text states, deep dishonor. It would shatter the social fabric of the colony.
So the men are completely paralyzed. Their military tactics have failed to produce a winner. Their cultural honor codes have locked them into a mutual suicide pact where they will simply continue to slaughter each other until both populations are decimated.
It becomes apparent that breaking this stalemate requires an entirely different kind of courage. A courage completely disconnected from swords and shields.
It requires the direct physical intervention of the victims themselves. The sources highlight a prominent Sabine woman named Hersilia, who steps forward as a crucial historical agent and formulates a daring plan.
Hersilia gathers the Sabine women within the city and essentially says, "The men cannot stop this. We have to stop it."
She proposes they march as a collective body to the Roman Senate and officially asks for permission to leave the safety of the walls and intercede directly on the battlefield.
The women, in a state of deep distress and agitation, enter the Senate chamber and beg the Roman leaders, "Let us go out to the Sabine camp and try to persuade our families to make peace."
The Roman Senate, recognizing the desperation of the military stalemate and the depletion of their own forces, is disposed to consent. However, the textual accounts reveal a profoundly grim and paranoid nuance regarding the conditions of this permission.
It strips away any romanticized view of this moment. This detail is incredibly dark. The women naturally want to take their infants with them as they go to plead with their fathers.
But the Roman senators, trapped in their military mindset, become deeply suspicious. They begin to fear a conspiracy.
They worry that the women, under the pretense of a peace mission, are actually seizing an opportunity to permanently escape the city, return to their Sabine families, and take the Roman children with them.
The absolute lack of trust between the husbands and wives in this specific moment is just palpable. To mitigate this perceived risk, the Senate imposes a chilling, draconian condition.
They decree that the women may go to the battlefield, but they must leave their babies behind inside the city walls to serve as human hostages.
These infants will guarantee the women's return. The only exception granted was for mothers who had 2 children. They were permitted to take one infant with them, leaving the other in the hands of the Senate.
Put yourself in the psychological reality of one of those mothers. You are being forced to leave your newborn baby in the custody of the men who originally kidnapped you as a guarantee that you will return.
You are doing this so you can walk unarmed out of the gates into a blood-soaked valley to face an army of your own heavily armed fathers and brothers who might accidentally strike you down in the chaos.
The personal, emotional stakes for these women could not possibly be higher.
It highlights the desperate fragility of the social bonds in early Rome and the immense, almost incomprehensible physical risk the women were assuming.
The visual description of their departure provided by the sources is haunting. They do not march out as diplomats, they march out as mourners.
The text describes a mournful procession moving slowly through the city gates and passing across the contested plain toward the Sabine lines.
Their hair is intentionally disheveled, their robes are disordered and torn to signify deep mourning, and their faces are wan with grief. And among them, some are carrying those single permitted infants in their arms.
It is a staggering image to imagine breaking through the fog of war. The Sabine sentries see them coming and halt the fighting. They are admitted into the captured citadel and ushered into the central council of the Sabine chieftains, which includes their own fathers.
When the women enter, the men are stunned into silence. The women break down, their tears and exclamations of grief echoing through the council. And then Hersilia steps forward to speak.
Hersilia's address to the Sabine leadership is a masterpiece of rhetorical brilliance, emotional logic, and profound political reframing.
She does not deny the trauma of the original kidnapping, but she radically shifts the context to force the men to confront the reality of the present.
She looks at the Sabine leaders, the men who raised her, and says, "We know you are waging this brutal war on our account. We understand you see it as proof of your love for us, a mission to avenge our honor, but what you think is saving us is actually the very thing destroying us."
Let us examine the specific logical progression of her argument as reported in the primary texts. She begins by validating their initial anger. "When we were first seized by the Romans, we felt greatly wronged." She acknowledges the crime.
But then she pivots to the undeniable sociological reality of the years that have passed. "Having submitted to our fate, we have now become settled in our new homes. We are contented and happy in them. We love our husbands, we love our children, and we are treated with the utmost kindness and respect." She
is essentially telling her fathers, "You are too late. The dynamic has irrevocably changed. We are no longer victims waiting for rescue. We are wives and mothers."
And her closing argument delivers a devastating emotional checkmate to the entire Sabine War effort. She states, "Do not, under a mistaken kindness for us, attempt to tear us away again. or continue this dreadful war, which, though ostensibly on our account and for our benefit, is really making us inexpressibly miserable.
It is a profound subversion of the male martial rescue narrative. The Sabine men believed they were restoring cosmic honor and saving helpless victims.
Hercilia forcefully articulates that their continued violence is, in fact, the sole source of the women's current misery. She strips away the abstract, glorious lens of honor and forces the chieftains to view the conflict through the lived, bloody reality of the very women they claim to care about.
They are killing the fathers of their grandchildren, and the most incredible part of this entire deep dive is, well, it works. It works absolutely perfectly.
The primary tests note that this intercession produced the exact psychological effect required. The hostility doesn't just pause, it simply vanishes.
It is as if a collective fever breaks across the valley. The Sabine leaders and the Roman commanders immediately step forward and begin negotiating in earnest.
As our source astutely observes regarding the mechanics of diplomacy, peace is easily made where both parties are honestly desirous of making it. They just needed an excuse to back down without losing face, and the women provided it.
The psychological relief on both sides must have been overwhelming. A massive emotional reaction took place. The reckless, desperate hostility that had choked the valley for days was entirely replaced by a sentiment of mutual survival, culminating in a radical, unprecedented treaty of union.
They didn't just sign a ceasefire, draw a border, and go home. They agreed to completely merge the two nations into one single entity.
The Sabine territory was fully annexed to Rome. Titus Tatius, the Sabine general, and all the principal Sabine chieftains agreed to physically relocate to Rome. Rome became the joint capital of this newly combined kingdom, with Romulus and Titus Tatius ruling as co-kings.
As Dionysius and Plutarch essentially conclude, never was a reconciliation between two belligerent nations so sudden, so total, and so complete. The existential war ended not with the annihilation of the enemy, but with their total integration into the Roman state.
Which brings us back to where we started, looking at the origins of a superpower. We trace this from Acron, a local warlord trying to crush a startup 4 miles down the road, leading to Romulus stripping armor in the dirt to forge the tradition of the Roman triumph.
We examined how Rome fundamentally transformed statecraft by turning conquered enemies from Caeninenses and Antemnates into full citizens, physically expanding the city's boundaries.
We dissected the harsh logistical realities of ancient warfare, the evacuation of the pastoral herdsmen, the terrifying reality of thousands of animals crammed behind wooden walls, and the starvation tactics of a stripped countryside.
We analyzed the topographical choke points of the Capitoline, the dark betrayal of Tarpeia, the brutal claustrophobic fighting in the muddy valley, and the chaotic unpredictability of a stone to the head or a hidden swamp.
But the absolute core of this history is that an impossible, bloody military stalemate was broken not by superior tactics, not by better weapons, and not by martial bravery.
It was broken by the profound courage and rhetorical brilliance of the women caught in the middle.
This historical narrative leaves us with a fascinating paradox to consider regarding the rise of empires. History, particularly Roman history, is overwhelmingly obsessed with the clash of swords, the gladiatorial duel between Romulus and Acron, the heavy shields crushing a traitor, the tactical maneuvers in the valley.
But the textual evidence strongly suggests that Rome's ultimate survival in its foundational crisis did not hinge on its military prowess. After all, the military conflict against the Sabines ended in a desperate bloody tie.
Rome's survival hinged entirely on the philosophy of assimilation. It survived because of its unique capacity to absorb its enemies rather than eradicate them.
The greatest, most crucial leap forward for the early Roman state wasn't a battle they decisively won. It was a war they were brave enough and wise enough to stop fighting.
It forces us to reevaluate what actually constitutes strength in statecraft. Is it the ability to destroy or the ability to integrate?
And I think that provides a deeply relevant question to leave you with as we wrap up this deep dive.
When we look at history, or even when we look at our own modern conflicts, whether they are personal disputes, political divides, or global standoffs, we often get trapped by our own definitions of honor or our need to win. It asks us to wonder, at what point does our stubborn insistence on rescuing a situation or defending our pride actually become the exact mechanism that destroys the very people or the very principles we claim to be fighting for?
A vital historical lesson regarding the limits of force and the power of empathy.
Keep questioning the narratives you've been handed. Keep looking at the messy, chaotic margins of history where the real mechanisms of human survival operate. Keep digging into the sources, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.